So why do we come together? What is it about this collection of people that really tells us something about the nature of the city? I believe that we spend so much of our time misunderstanding what the real genius of the city is about. And it was with these questions in mind that I went to Bangalore in order to meet a group of online activists called the Ugly Indian. Now, this group were anonymous. They refused to have any kind of manifesto or any kind of publicity, and yet what they were doing was fascinating. They had become frustrated with the local authorities and the government who were taking too much time in order to really patch up and repair the abandoned parts of their city. So instead, what they were doing was looking at that space no more than 50 yards in front of their front doorstep and really transforming the city. The only problem was, even by the time I got to Bangalore, they hadn't replied to my emails. And yet, so I just sat in my hotel room, desperate for them to get in contact. It was only by the end of the day that they gave me a time and a location the next day. And so the next morning, I crossed what is possibly one of the most congested cities in modern India and found myself at what was a fairly ordinary city street. On one side was a brand new, shiny office block, and on the other side was an abandoned plot. This area, nobody really knew who owned this space. It had been allowed to become something of a rubbish tip. And on this morning, I found myself amongst a group of office workers, clearly people who had been working at that new office space. And yet they were out here on the street and working alongside the Ugly Indians. And what they were doing is they rolled up their business shirt sleeves and started to cut back the brush, to reset the pavement. And by the end of the day, we were planning to, in some ways, replant the borders. There was something that was fascinating that was going on within this group. For this was a place that they had probably walked past for months on their way to work every single day. And yet, here they were working this place. And suddenly, over the course of the day, that place became their place. And that problem became their problem. And over time, you could see that that problem had become their neighborhood. But there was something else that was going on during that time. For as we stopped in the mid-morning heat and we had a discussion about what to do next, you could hear in people's voices that there was an excitement, there was something else that was going on underneath the activity. For as we were reclaiming that part of the city, something else was changing. For as we recreated the neighborhood, we also recreated citizens. And it strikes me that this is one of the key questions when we consider the city of the future. Who is the city for? How do we come together? And what are the rules and the regulations of citizenship in the future city? Now, we all know that by 2007, the world had become 50% urban, and this is only going to increase. By current estimations, there are 180,000 people arriving at the gates of the city somewhere in the world every single day. That means that every single day, 180,000 people are coming to the city in order to make themselves a home and in order to become citizens. At the same time, travel between the great metropolitan centers has created this extraordinarily fluid network of people. What is the citizen of the future city? What are the rules and the regulations that allow us to belong to that place? Now, it strikes me that while we talk often about technology or economics or even placemaking, there isn't enough discussion about civics, about what it means to belong. And so what I want to propose today is a social urbanism, an urbanism which puts people right at the very heart of it. So often we talk about cities being made out of people and not buildings, but what happens if we actually put people at the center of all our decision making? What happens if we put people at the center of the very idea of what a good city can be? Now, I believe that cities are good for us. I believe the city is the greatest social experiment in human history. I think the city is proof that we are meant to be together. And this is exactly what Jan Gehl, the Danish architect, I think concluded when he went back to Strøget in order to find out why this project, one of his very first projects, was so successful. At the beginning of this project, as he was pedestrianizing the central places of Copenhagen, the locals said, "We're Danes, we're not Italians, we don't sit around and drink coffee." And yet within the very first month, people came to this place, and people came in extraordinary numbers until Strøget became really the public center of the city. And so Jan Gehl wanted to go and watch and learn why this life between the buildings, as he calls it, was so successful. So he watched the way people moved, how they interacted, where they stopped and where they lingered. And what he discovered is that undoubtedly a number of people went there and stopped in front of shop windows and did their window shopping, or other people would stop in front of the cinema to see what was playing. But the two places where they really stopped and lingered with some intent, one was in front of a building site, and the other was in front of street performers. And what Jan Gehl concluded, and I think he's absolutely right, is the thing that people are most interested in is other people. And people come to places like Strøget in order to be with other people. And yet, I think there is something more than just the collection of individuals within one space which makes up a city. This is something I believe that Jane Jacobs was indicating when she talked about the ballet of a good city street in her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. As she stood outside her house at 555 Hudson Street and watched the daily goings-on of an ordinary street, of an ordinary city, right from the very first moments of the day to the moments of the muffled police sirens at the end of the day, what she was watching was the subtle and intimate interreaction of people, of neighbors getting along, of lives interweaving. And this, I believe, is the genius of the metropolis. It seems so simple, but it is that interconnection that comes about on an ordinary city street that then is also the genius of the city as a whole. For it is these connections, if you like, these interweavings, this fabric of urban life, which allows the city to become more than the sum of its parts. And so, on top of this idea of an ordinary city street, there have been a number of studies that have looked at this genius of the metropolis. You could call it complexity, or you can call it emergence. But really, it is what happens when we come together. So Geoffrey West at the Santa Fe Institute is fascinating about the influence of number upon cities, and how, as cities become larger, they become richer and more productive. They also become more creative and greener. In 2011, there was a report that was done by the Young Foundation, taking 3 different parts of the UK, one only a mile up the road at Newham here, another in a new town in Cambridgeshire, and the third a collection of villages in Wiltshire, looking at levels of civility and politeness. And what it discovered that in Newham, in this marketplace, despite the fact that this was one of the poorest neighborhoods in London, one of the most diverse in Europe, it was actually here where you found the largest levels of civility and politeness. It was here that people learnt to get along, where they learnt the rules of being citizens. The third report was published only last month from Hatfield, which looked at the relationship between being part of a crowd and levels of happiness. And we so often assume that being part of a crowd means that we lose something. that we abandon our sense of self and our personal space is invaded. In fact, it's completely the opposite. What this report showed is that the more that one invests within the group, the more that one feels part of the crowd, the happier that one becomes. And so this idea of us coming together really is at the heart of a social urbanism. But you cannot have social urbanism without the places where this can occur. Now, the public spaces of the city can be a number of different things. It can be from the street, like Hudson Street, or it can be even a bike lane or the great central spaces of the city. What is always true, particularly at around 8:30 on the bus routes in West End Lane, is that these spaces are continuously congested and contested, that these places are under threat at all times. So public space continuously has to be reclaimed, just like the ugly Indians reclaimed the space no more than 50 yards in front of their office. And this contest, this challenge and threat can take many different forms. A public space has to be a place where we can protest, where our voices can be heard, where our differences can be managed. It's also a place where, more often than not, our relationships are being reduced to being a buyer or a seller or a property owner or a renter. The proliferation of CCTV cameras or security by design, for me, challenges and compromises the promise of public space in order to create citizens. I was reminded of this during the summer when on the 17th of June, a young man called Erdem Gündüz walked into Taksim Square. He put down his bag, which had a couple of bottles of water in it, and he turned to face the Ataturk Cultural Center. And here he stood for the next 8 hours. 2 days beforehand, this same site had been the place of conflict where hundreds of protesters had clashed with the local police. And during the interim period, the government had banned all forms of protest. And so Erdem Gündüz stood here in stillness and in silence over the next 8 hours. And during that period, another 300 people came and joined him, not saying a word and not moving. And yet, like the ugly Indians, he came to that place and he made his citizenship known. And he reclaimed his right to be a citizen. And so taking these two stories, taking the story of the ugly Indian and Erdem Gündüz, Gündüz reminds us that we have to be there. And the ugly Indian reminds us that we have to take action. So the idea of a social urbanism has to combine the idea of place, of action, and finally, of citizenship. And so when we think about this social urbanism, when we think about the city of the future and how we make it a place for people, I want to propose 3 what I would call key values that would underpin any understanding of what this city could be. The first is trust. Trust seems so unbelievably simple, but it's the civic value that we don't talk enough about. Trust is the thing that allows that interweaving connections to occur. And yet, how do we build trust? Trust can't just be a single design. It isn't just a moment where you put something up and then there, trust is ready. Instead, it's a bit like the Pompidou Center, where you see and what you notice first is Rogers's and Renzo Piano's extraordinary building. But actually, that only takes up half the plot. When there was invitations for design, what Rogers did is he actually only filled half the space with a building. The rest is that place, is that space where people can come together, where people can learn the rules of being together, where they can learn to be citizens. But there's one thing that really undermines trust. and that is inequality. Boris Johnson, only a couple of weeks ago, said that a little envy goes a long way, and that inequality is in many ways the engine of the contemporary city. I'm afraid to say I don't agree. In fact, I think completely the opposite. In London at the moment, the top 10% is 230 times richer than the bottom 10%. I mean, and yet, the idea of inequality and the city, I think, is something that we've become almost used to, that we accept it. But there is nothing in the nature of the city that says it has to be unequal. In the same way, there is nothing in the nature of a complex system that says that inequality makes it work better, or somehow it is supposed to be this way. And so when we think about social urbanism, we need to think about equality. Because not only does it make a fragile city, it creates a geography of difference. It creates places where we can't go, places that aren't free and open. And in the end, what it does do is it destroys the dream of having a resilient city. Because you can talk about technology, or you can talk about economics, and you can talk about placemaking, creating resilience. But if you don't have resilient community, if you don't have resilient people, then you don't have anything. And the final value, I think, which is absolutely essential to a social urbanism, is the right to the city. Because if a city is not for everybody, then who is it for? So going back to those original questions, when we think about the city of the future, when we think about what we need to do in order to rewrite the script of the future city, please think not just about technology, not just about economics, and not just about placemaking, but trust, equality, and the city for all. Thank you very much.